everyone. I'm Paul Perry. I'm the museum's education director, and thank you for coming to the program today. The military has made significant strides over the past decade to become a more diverse workforce. Much of the back and forth legislation to get us to where we are today has been complex and sometimes confusing to those outside the LGBTQ community. Our panel today looks at one segment of that community, those who are transgender, to examine how the rights of transgender persons were not recognized or acknowledged in the armed services until a DoD policy shift in 2021. Why was this? To what extent does the new policy change things? Is there a sense that those non-LGBTQ persons within the military complex really understand the concept of gender equity or care about the trans community? These and other questions will be explored by our panel, moderated by former Navy Chief Intelligence Specialist Melody Stackhour. Melody, would you raise your hand?
That's me.
So before I turn the floor over to Melody and our panelists, I want to remind everyone we are recording this. So if you would please turn off your cell phones so we don't get any unwanted rings or bells and whistles during the recording. And so with that, Melody, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. So I will clarify, I'm actually a Navy reservist. I still serve in uniform, doing work for the Navy. Honestly, as a Navy chief, more often than the sales pitch, right? It's definitely not one weekend a month for me as a senior enlisted member. I'll be approaching my 18th anniversary in the Navy in just a couple months, and still several years to go. Still having a great time doing it. I'm gonna invite each of our panelists. I didn't understand the rules that I was supposed to get, but that somehow I seem to understand a different set of rules that were around me and were very clearly there, and yet I didn't match the characteristics of people who got those rules, right? So it's things like that you look back and go, oh yeah, that was an egg moment. That was an egg moment. For sure. August?
I'm in kind of a similar boat. I did grow up knowing that trans people existed, but to my understanding,
That's because you're a baby.
I am a baby, that's true. But to my understanding, a trans person is someone who knows that they're trans pretty much from day one of life, and just like it's so ingrained, like I was trapped in the wrong body, I know what I'm supposed to be, I just need to go out and do it, and I'm stopped by society. That wasn't the case for me. I always knew there was something wrong with me, I just didn't know what. I tried on a lot of different identities, nothing really seemed to fit. I was very lucky. I actually went to a women's college. I went to Wellesley, and it wasn't uncommon for people there to sort of explore gender in various ways using different pronouns, different presentations, things like that. So I did a little bit of, I went by they, them pronouns for a while. I cut my hair short as soon as I got out of my parents' house. And eventually I think it was really the pandemic. I had a lot of time to sort of sit with myself and reflect. And I kind of came to the conclusion that actually I'm August. I'm a guy. And so, a lot of people do this and then it takes years for them to even think about accessing hormones, because of either medical barriers or even people will wait to be sure. And I just got on. I started medically transitioning right away, and I haven't had a single regret. I'm really glad to be who I am and where I am, and that's how I got here.
Fantastic.
And saying no regrets is not the same thing as saying no unexpected difficulties.
Right.
Yes, I'm not saying that transphobia doesn't exist.
Oh, no, it's not saying no hurdles, no unexpected difficulties, no any of that. Just knowing full well that you've hit a spot where you wouldn't dream of going back. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, many anti-trans activists try to recast any trans person's expression of, well, gee, I wasn't expecting to run into this problem, as a regret of transitioning. That is not true.
No, definitely not. The other thing that's often recast in a negative light is people who decide to, and the hostile space was harder than, retreating into armor again. And in many, many cases, those folks will turn around and break out of the armor again once they are in a more welcoming space. I think my story is, very similar. I think more similar to yours, Natalie, in that, I joined the Navy in 2004. I did a full tour of active duty, left active duty, and then started to encounter
With Planned Parenthood, learn about the medication that I would be taking, and be prescribed it. Usually, in most states, you're required to get letters from mental health professionals diagnosing you with gender dysphoria, and in order to get anything, and that was something I encountered for other medical care down the line. So that's one barrier, is just having to go around to these different professionals, these different clinics, and depending on what state you live in, it can be extremely difficult to find a clinic that will prescribe you hormones at all, even with a letter. A lot of people are not big fans of trans folks. A lot of people aren't fans of giving trans care. I was lucky, like I said. I can't count the number of stories I've seen from people saying, hey, I have my letters, I jumped through the therapy hoops, I proved to my therapist that I'm enough of a man or a woman or something in between, that I need hormones. But now no one will prescribe them to me because I've gone to doctors and they've said, we don't do that here. So what's the clinic in my area that I can find care at? And it can be hard, it can be far.
Thank the gods for Planned Parenthood.
Thank the gods for Planned Parenthood. I know.
Among many others, there are a fairly robust number now of queer clinics around the country that do informed consent, to be fair. Here in the district, we have access to Whitman Walker, who also does informed consent, which is fantastic.
In Maryland, we have Chase Brexton.
Chase Brexton in Baltimore. Yes, so there are lots of great queer clinics around the country that will do informed consent. And also, in many places, the only clinics that are available are Planned Parenthood that will do informed consent. So, thank goodness for a network like Planned Parenthood that will enable that kind of access, for sure.
Did that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. One of the interesting things, interesting in a historical sense, not interesting in a wonderful sense, 30 years ago, the diagnosis that you had to get from a mental health provider required, so many steps and so many presentations that not only could we three probably not access care, but the women in this room probably would not have been able to check all the boxes as women, and the men in this room would probably not have been able to check all the boxes as men. They were that restrictive in ability to access care. And as a result, not only did it create a system whereby, care was essentially impossible to access, but that, in order to try to access care, people were spending, inordinate amounts of time studying what the requirements were so that they could play up their experience or lack thereof in order to get a therapist to check those boxes.
Like, oh, you don't like wearing goofy pink chenille dresses every single day of the week?
Down, Jack, you're done. We'll see
Yeah.
you next year, try again.
And think about how difficult it is to fully present as female before going on any sort of hormones. Like, you can't just like go to the doctor in like a t-shirt and jeans. You have to be like completely like, right? Like dressed up.
Oh yeah, fully
Yeah,
femme.
yeah.
Dress
Fully
fully femme. You know, think high femme all the time.
Yeah.
If you want to be able to access care. It was
Not
kind of
cool.
ridiculous. And while the check boxes have reduced and we have, mercifully, moved from the idea of having a disorder to the idea of having dysphoria, which literally means your sense of gender dysphoria, literally your sense of gender doesn't align with how you were assigned. We still have lots of situations, both in the civilian world and in the military, whereby those therapist appointments are required. In order to access care for any military member, whether active or reserve, and have it recognized by the military health system, we have put into place the requirements that you do the therapy appointments, you get your diagnosis of gender dysphoria, you get a treatment plan built, and then you say, "Pretty please may I," to your commanding officer, who is not a doctor and not a healthcare provider, because the mission is still paramount. And over the past, 6 years since we initially had open trans service, after Secretary Carter, opened the doors in June of 2016. We have seen a variety of reactions from commanding officers, from fully supportive, let me sign it today so that you can go back and get started on your medical visits right away, to we have a deployment coming up in a year and a half, you need to wait until after that. Because commanding officers are given the latitude to say, this is the timing you're allowed to do. The thing that I always say when I have the opportunity to talk to a CO, an XO, a CMC, a chief's mess, anybody, is that all that time you're asking someone to delay, you're also asking them to be distracted. You're saying, I expect you to do your 100% of your job while you are fully distracted by the fact that you cannot access your medical care. And the reality is, there's not a whole lot of downtime to access medical care. Certainly, if you present, hey, I'd like to get treatment, a week before your deployment, that's one thing, okay? I still would submit that, with the advent of telehealth that we've been able to do a lot of during the pandemic, and the fact that, certainly in the Navy, most battle groups go out with at least one fully staffed hospital, whereby you have corpsmen who can draw labs. It's not as challenging in the Navy as it is in some of our sister services, right? I don't think it would necessarily be as simplistic, for someone to go out on an deployment in the Army, especially if they were not expecting to stay on an operating base, because of the within the first few weeks of starting hormones, just because of the nature of the space that you're in. But a Navy ship is, it's no Hilton, but it's also a fairly controlled environment. And we have the ability to do a lot of things because of the nature of the Navy that some of our sister services don't. And so being cognizant of the difference between who we are as Navy and our sister services should help and inform our ability to access care in a more convenient manner, just because we take our medical services with us all the time, even when we're going underway.
Anything else lined up? We want to open it to
Let's open to questions and let's see what comes up. So we want to take some time and offer you the chance to ask, all of your impertinent questions, and we promise to explain to you why a question is impertinent rather than just
Jumping down your throats.
exactly. But please, what questions do we have in the room?
Don't be shy.
You have the opportunity to ask a trans person anything.
Paul, Isaiah.
So I wanted to get back a little bit about the Navy experience.
Yeah.
I guess specifically I want to know, Melody, some specific things about your experience being a Navy person.
Sure.
That you may have felt that all this progress up until now legislatively, I mean, has it really been working for the trans community, or do you still feel there's kind of a vacuum where the military leadership, if you will, they don't really get it, they don't really understand? I mean, you know, gay, lesbian, bisexual, those are easy to understand for most people in the public.
Easier, maybe.
But when you say I'm transgender or I'm transsexual, then kind of the eyes glaze over.
Sure.
And I just want to know, did you kind of experience that specifically in your military career?
Okay, so
Any
history
stories
lesson.
you want to share?
By show of hands, you know, I assume, but by show of hands, how many people in here are familiar with the Red Scare of the 1950s? Good. How many people in the room are familiar with the Lavender Scare of the 1950s? Much fewer hands. For those on video, there are 2 or 3 hands in the room rather than all hands in the room. In the 1950s, at the same time as the Red Scare and Joe McCarthy was trying to root communists out of the woodwork and have them removed both from the government and from, you know, active society. In a much more quiet fashion, the government was doing the same things to the queer community, okay? And it's known as the Lavender Scare. You know, that's when you start to see executive orders saying, you know, queer people can't hold a security clearance because they can be blackmailed. Well, why can they be blackmailed? Because if they're out, they'll lose their security clearance. You can see the circular logic here, and yet it was part of the logic that was used. But during the mid and late 50s was when, you know, queer people were forced out of the government, or if they were in the government, were forced underground. It's the same time frame in which, you know, we go from, you know, tacitly ignoring the fact that queer people are serving, you know, because we'll draft anybody. You know, in World War II and in Korea, we would draft anybody. And only if it got to be a serious problem would they say, no, we need to get out of here. But, you know, into the late 50s, it started to become an active, we're going to hunt you down, we're going to kick you out now. And there are plenty of really high quality stories from people of those eras about, you know, the investigations that went on simply at the notion that someone might be queer in any way, shape, or form. You know, don't ask, don't tell for all of the things that was wrong with it was an important step forward. Because we went from, we heard something that made us suspect, so we're going to investigate you until we find something, whether there's something to be found or not, to we didn't ask, we don't know anything, all you have to do is not be blatant about it, and we don't have a case to get rid of you. The point of don't ask, don't tell was to stop the drop of a hat investigations. And it did, by and large. Nothing is perfect, nothing is ever exactly what it's supposed to be, but by and large it stopped the drop of the hat investigations. It was an important step forward. It also lasted too long.
Mm-hmm.
It lasted for 17 years before repeal came. At which point, you know, we went from, you know, you can serve but only in silence to now you can serve openly for people who are same-sex attracted. And over those 17 years of serving in silence, you know, a lot of people came to understand their colleagues and who they were. And by the time repeal came, 17 years later, there were very few people still serving who had served through the era of you can't be queer in the military at all. And so while it may not have been openly acknowledged that you're serving with someone who's gay, you're serving with someone who's lesbian, the reality was it was true. You were serving with someone who was gay or who's lesbian. Literally everybody who was in the military at that point had served with queer people. And so when repeal came, the act was signed in 2010, the implementation in 2011, there wasn't a whole lot of change that had to be made. I mean, the biggest changes were, now you can put a picture up on your desk. Now you can talk about, yes, I went out with my girlfriend this weekend. And no one gets to say that you're wrong for saying so. No one gets to say, okay, we're gonna try to kick you out for saying so. When 2016 rolled around, on the other hand, nobody knew that they'd been serving with trans people for 5, 10, 15 years. Nobody realized, unless you were in a unit with one of the handful of people that had literally risked their career coming out because they had no choices left that didn't lead to either, getting kicked out the way they had come out, or, continuing to suppress, which probably was going to lead to self-harm. And so they came out, as an act of last resort, and were able to become fully themselves, and also were risking their career in the process. And so when open service came in 2016, there were 8 or 10 people in the military who were out as trans. And then all of a sudden this floodgate has opened. And so over the past 6 years, what you've seen is people getting their minds wrapped around the idea that that trans people exist and are in the military and are doing a job. My story is very much one of, I had come to terms with myself. Like I said, 2012 was when I started to have an inkling that I was trans. I had some understanding that repeal was likely to happen in 2016, and I was starting to make plans. I'm gonna come out, I'm gonna get my letters, I'm gonna do all the things, and somewhere in the fall of 2016, I'm gonna tell the Navy and I'm gonna start transitioning. On June 27th, 2016, I got a phone call from my commanding officer saying, congratulations, your number has come up, you're getting mobilized to go downrange, you're gonna be deployed for all of 2017. Enjoy your mobilization, it'll be great for you, it'll be a great experience, it'll be great for your career. And I'm sitting here thinking, all of that is true, and also, what do I do now? Because on June 30th, 3 days later, was the announcement from Secretary Carter that open service was going to be available for trans folks. Me as a first class who was up for chief at that point, and really considering, I mean, by that point I was 12 years in, and looking at the back half of a career that would lead to a Navy retirement, and going, I'm not the sort of person who can do all this, drop out of a mobilization right before I go, wind up forcing a shipmate from who knows where to mobilize on 2 months' notice, and fall out of a mobilization. So I, like so many other people who are trans in the military, did what we talk about so often, and that is I went with service before self. And on December 29th, 2016, I was rolled from the reserve component back to the active component for a year's mobilization. So I am overseas by this summer of 2016, working on, being quiet about things and, making use of coping mechanisms, because I hadn't planned to stay closeted that long. And, you know, I'm in Intel, so I'm working on a watch floor. I remember vividly waking up the morning of July 27th, 2017, and through the very limited time I had to, you know, check social media, see what was going on, discovered that there had been an announcement of potential policy on Twitter. Nobody knew, did this carry the force of law? Nobody knew how urgent this was going to be. Nobody knew when things were going to happen. Meantime, the announcement of potential policy said, I, as someone who was trans, was no longer welcome to serve. But I didn't know what that meant, given that I'm downrange actually doing the job that we call upon our military to do, and yet somehow the announcement of policy claimed that I was unqualified. And I'm not gonna lie, that was the hardest day of my deployment. Not because the work was difficult, but because I didn't know what my future in the Navy looked like. Because I didn't know if I was gonna be here tomorrow, to say nothing of finish my deployment or be able to head towards a Navy retirement. So in that hour, you know, between getting up and getting to work, because when you're deployed, your barracks room is 5 minutes from your office. Let's be real. I went through all sorts of permutations of what's going on. I got onto the watch floor, took my turnover, started doing my, you know, turnover logs, getting things done, and I overheard, you know, the folks in the row behind me, who were on a different schedule for turnover, talking a little bit because we were in a little bit of a lull in activity. And they were talking about the tweeted policy. And the consensus, you know, and there were 5 or 6 of them back there talking, you know, the consensus was very much being trans was not what concerned them. What concerned them was, is it a person who is going to get trained, is going to come downrange, is going to get the job done, is going to have their back. That's it. That was their concern. And that was what settled me down and made me able to do my job the rest of the day. Because I knew, even though they didn't know that I was trans, I knew they had my back because they knew I had theirs. Right? It's that, you know, it's that brotherhood, sisterhood of service in arms. You know, we were still all together. And that was after a year and a half of open service. That was after a year of open service. 6 years on, the reality is anybody who's, you know, E5 and below, anybody who's 03 and below, has almost not known a military where we don't have open service. The holdouts tend to remain in, you know, the senior ranks, whereby in places where, thanks to the fact that I now have anchors on, I have a little more access and can say, hey, look, pipe down, this is who we are, this is what we want to do, and the fact that we are here to serve the same as you means that your job as a leader is to enable us to serve, not to wonder if we're capable. And so, there are certainly still holdouts. There are certainly still people who don't get it. There are certainly still people who prioritize mission at the expense of sailors. And that sucks at a whole lot of levels that those people are still around. And those people haven't yet figured out that prioritizing sailors is prioritizing mission. And also, the ranks of people who don't get it and who are trying to make it somebody else's problem grow smaller every day. And we're only 6 years on. You know, in another 3-4 years, you know, the ranks of people that don't get it or will not have had, you know, the chance to talk to someone like me will be dwindling down to, you know, a pile of matchsticks. That, as a pile of matchsticks, yeah, it'll burn for a minute, and then it'll go out. It's not about to light a major fire without, you know, huge amounts of kindling and fuel on. So for me personally, I've had a phenomenal experience because I was somewhat senior. I had easy access to my leaders when I came out. I knew policy backwards, forwards, inside out, and upside down. And so I was the SME. And also, you know, we live in a military whereby, you know, sometimes you have to find the SME, which is why I get phone calls from chiefs all around the world saying, hey Melody, I just had someone come out, can you help me work through this because I've never had to deal with this? Sure sis, let's talk through it, we'll go over it, I'll help you understand what their needs are going to be, so that you have the ability to advocate for your sailors with your skipper and keep things rolling well, not just for your sailor, but for your mission too.
Can you talk a little bit about the organization that you are involved with, or, I'm sorry, I forget the name of it. Did you actually found that organization?
So, I currently serve as one of the, I'm outgoing Navy chapter leader with an organization called Sparta. And I'm incoming as Director of Community Partnerships. So my service to Sparta is not going away. And I do this in my own time. But Sparta exists really for two reasons. One is to provide, you know, a support and mentorship group for trans service members everywhere. So all eight uniformed services are welcome to join. Yes, we're up to 8 now, because don't forget, NOAA has a uniformed service, and Public Health Service has a commissioned corps, so that makes 8. That said, we also exist to try to advocate for improved policy. You know, we have the good fortune of having built relationships, you know, in the Service Central Coordination Cells in the Pentagon, so they come to us, to the long-standing relationships, you know, and say, can you send someone who as part of their military duties can speak to the way things are going? And so we serve as, and I hate the term, but it's well known, we serve kind of as a belly button for, hey, we need some subject matter experts in being trans to come over, can you help recommend some people? You know, and we do, you know, we have the ability at that point to recommend policy. Obviously, we don't write policy or recommend changes to policy. You know, I think all of us as military members have a responsibility to recommend changes to policies that aren't working. It takes a while to implement those things, but that's part of our responsibilities as military members is to recommend changes to policies that aren't working. And, you know, because we are, you know, interested not just in today or next week or next month, you know, we maintain, you know, a list of, you know, people and suggested discussion points and an awareness for what's happening on the Hill, because I'm a Navy sailor, I'm also a citizen, which means I have the right to call my congresspeople, I have the right to call my senators, and advocate for change in that manner as well. You know, I'm not an activist, but I do want to make change so that, you know, the part of my bio that kind of got left out, you know, in the summer of 2020, I was selected by the National Navy Information Forces Reserve to be the senior enlisted leader of the Navy Reserve Unit. That made me the first sailor in the Navy to be selected not just as a senior enlisted leader somewhere, but as anyone in the command triad who was trans, open, and out, whose identity as someone who was trans was already known going into the selection panel and was selected for one of those jobs. That makes me the first. If I'm the last, we have done our jobs wrong. We have done our jobs poorly. You know, being the first is, quite honestly, not all it's cracked up to be. because it also means a lot of microscopes and a lot of floodlights. And also, you know, I don't hate being the first. I would hate being the last. I want sailors coming up to see someone like them who they can go, not only am I going to be like her, I'm going to do one better. You know what, shipmate? Good on you. I don't ever want to be seen as the best sailor in the world. I just want to be a good sailor and a good leader for my sailors. What else is on your mind? Yeah.
Well, I thought this might be impertinent, but since you identified as a SME on all of this, I feel less bad asking it. But our mission here is to preserve, present an accurate history of the United States Navy. And so what does that look like for you? How would you like your story incorporated in a museum such as this? Because there are deep questions here, because you've talked about the mission coming first, and that's what you're very proud of, is meeting mission. So how do you see these different aspects of your narrative sort of intention within a historical knowledge product, to put it in a government language? You know, Natalie or August, if you want to take a stab at it too. And once again, you can consider this impertinent as putting you on the spot and asking you to be the spokesperson for a community.
You know what, I appreciate the impertinence. I'm going to say that's a really tough question. You know, in some ways, I see myself as, you know, falling in, you know, a line of the march of history. And while I can't identify, you know, necessarily first person advanced to chief on 1st of April 1893, you know, we know the name Loretta Walsh. We know the name Anna de Vartanian. You know, and I see myself as another in the line of the sorts of people that did something first, even if they didn't necessarily do it best, fastest, or you know, what made them the person who was worthy of being first. You know, I would see myself as another in a line of people who are trying to make the Navy better, and you know, my name might be, you know, one of those names people know in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and if it's not, you know, I don't hate the idea that, you know, other people might supersede me and might be more worthy of, you know, canonization, for lack of a better term, in, you know, in the world of historical standouts. I think the march towards, you know, an integrated and inclusive military, you know, certainly started, you know, a long time ago, whether it was, you know, the Women's Auxiliary, the integration of people of color into integrated units, through the integration of women as full members of the military rather than as an auxiliary corps, whether it was the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, whether it was the inclusion of women into all roles, including combat roles in the military. You know, it's a march of progress, and it's a continuing effort, because becoming a fully inclusive military, becoming the best Navy we can be, is a long march towards cultural change. Because when we started, you know, we had, by and large, we had, you know, white COs, and, you know, if men of color were serving, they were either, you know, servants and stewards, slaves, or, you know, very low and very heavily in danger on board ship. And, you know, look at where we have come, and look at how much our culture has changed and evolved in the Navy. Our Navy culture has changed and evolved over the past, you know, 200 and almost 50 years. And at the same time, we, to be real, discrimination still occurs in our Navy every day. I'm not proud of that, but I'm aware of the fact that it's true, and that only by understanding that it is true can we make strides to change that and make our Navy better. Do you want to take a stab at what the canonization or recognition of queer rights, either in or out of the military, as an organization dedicated to history might be? I mean, I've been speaking for a little bit, so please. Oh, go ahead, sorry.
I mean, obviously you are far from the first trans person to serve in the Navy or the U.S. military. You are
completely true.
You are not the first to achieve some measure of success, but you may be the first to do so openly.
Exactly.
When we talk about the history of trans people in the military, we need to go way back. It doesn't start with her.
Right.
There are songs about women who cut their hair and joined the Navy.
Right.
And in a modern framework, we may recognize these people as trans men.
Or at a minimum, gender non-conforming.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I do want to point out,
we can't overlay assumptions, of course.
Right.
I just want to say a lot of those people then went on to live the rest of their lives as men and marry women and died as men. So it's it is not often that far of a leap to make.
And the story of Albert Cashier during the Civil War is a good example of that. Yes, sorry. Go on. I was trying not to interrupt. Sorry.
No, that's really the only place I was going with that. To put this into even more historical context.
Yeah.
This didn't start with the executive order.
No, by no stretch. I mean, we saw the book and the documentary from Kristen Beck-Seal, before I had planted the flag in what my identity was, and she was not the first. She was one of the earlier names that was known, and she came out after she'd retired. But looking back at her story, she knew while she was in, and she was one of those people who, when she had the opportunity, was being herself, and then she put the armor back on to go back to mission. And so that's an important point, well taken, that the word openly is what defines my story compared to other people's. My trans elders in the Navy, didn't have, in many cases, didn't have the luxury to serve openly, did not have the opportunity to serve openly.
And granted, I do not have any military experience myself, but I don't think I'm making a leap here to say that we need our service people to be as focused as they possibly can on the mission, to that all their mental and physical and emotional energy needs to be targeted towards achieving the mission goals.
Yeah.
Not being able to admit something as fundamental to one's identity as one's gender, that takes a lot of energy. If you are doing that, you cannot be 100% committed to your mission, whether that mission is military or anything you're trying to do in your life. It's impossible. You can't give everything that you can or that you want to if you are spending so much time and effort hiding.
Perfectly said. Thanks. I know we're getting short on time, but if there's one more question, I think we would love to answer. Yeah.
So, I've got one and I'm not exactly sure how to frame it, so
It's all right.
I'm gonna sort of launch this, and I promise there's a question hiding in here. I have 5 kids. My 21-year-old son identifies as pansexual, and that's been its own journey, but he's a relatively comfortable young man with who he is and where he is. And he's a part of this kind of queer community, and about 2 months ago, we had one of his friends over for a week to stay at our house. Now, Jack had been assigned female at birth, but was now out, I think relatively recently, was out as male, claiming he, his, him pronouns, and my name is Jack, and this sort of thing. Pleasant young man. Stayed at our house for a week, like I said. And then, you know, a few weeks after he left, I noticed that this little community was all a Twitter fighting with each other, right? And you know, over Discord and whatever else the kids use to talk to each other. Being the good dad that I am, I inquired into this. And it turns out that they were mad at Jack because Jack was claiming male pronouns but not doing enough to be male. And I said in my naivete, I said, well, John, I thought the whole thing was kind of whatever was working for you. That's what you got to claim. And I got, yeah, you're straight, so you wouldn't understand. But, you know, that he can't just, you know, claim these pronouns and do this thing, but then not do anything else about it. So I suppose that's the question that's
Sure you can.
somewhere. Well, that's what I thought.
I mean,
right?
my simple answer to you is sure you can. I mean, I will not speak for my colleagues up here, but I know that I, for a long time, you know, dealt with the question of, well, am I really trans enough? Yes?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Am I really trans enough? And we do that to ourselves, and to be perfectly honest, outsiders doing it to us, mostly just pisses us off.
Sure.
If I had not been brainwashed by these checklists of, you know, these are the things that prove you are trans, if I had not been exposed to that, I probably would have come out 20 years ago.
Yep.
You know, instead it's, oh, I only check 8 out of these 10 boxes, so
I'm not
obviously
trans
don't
enough.
qualify. Precisely.
Right. The other thing that I would submit is that, you know, coming out, deciding on your name and your pronouns is not a one-time deal. You know, I experimented with other names before I settled on Melody as my first name. Natalie, you're nodding. I'm guessing you did something similar.
I cheated. I picked my new name so that I wouldn't have to change my email address.
I mean, that's fair. That's fair. I mean,
Make it similar enough to the old one. But.
there are plenty of people that choose their name based on the name they were given at birth, their natal name, and there are plenty of people who change it completely. I changed mine completely, to be honest. You know what when I first planted my flag of having trans identity, I hadn't solidified exactly what my trans identity looked like. You know, Jack may be, you know, fully transmasculine. Jack may be some variety of non-binary. Jack may be, you know, a demi-boy. You know, there are so many words that describe, you know, what this particular individual's identity might settle at. And it's okay to explore it a little bit while you're settling at it, even if, you know that your orbit is circling something. I actually saw a really good description the other day about, you know, gender identity and, you know, how many people visualize it as a continuum with male on one hand, female on the other hand, and non-binary is kind of somewhere in the middle. And the reality is more like male is one star of great gravitation, and female is another star of great gravitation in a binary system. And whether you orbit one of the stars, both of the stars, have an elliptical orbit close to one of the stars and not the other one at all.
Find the Lagrange point right in the center.
Right, is much more descriptive of how, gender exists. Yeah, a lot of people orbit fairly close to one of the centers of gravity. And also, comets, Lagrange points, asteroids, all of those sorts of things exist in our solar system of gravity. Why can't they exist in our understanding of gender? Because the reality is they very much do. And so figuring out what, if you're a comet, or if you're a Pluto, or if you're Mercury, or where you are in that binary system of, two big centers of gravity, it can take time, and that's okay.
Do I have a minute or two to add something?
Yeah.
Yes,
1 minute.
just
Okay,
a minute.
Let's go.
Go for it.
I have 2 points. One is we just discussed the difficulty of medical transition, all of the hoops that you have to jump through. We don't know anything about Jack's family, how supportive they are of any changes that he might want to make. So it's possible that he's trying, and they just don't see him as trying hard enough. And that is a possibility. And the other thing is that you wouldn't deny anyone else their gender and their pronoun. If your daughter comes home one day with and is wearing like I said earlier, a t-shirt and jeans, you wouldn't suddenly say
I'd totally shake head.
yeah, you wouldn't suddenly say, well, you're not a woman.
Or even a three-piece suit. It's-
Yeah,
Right?
Or
Exactly.
Similarly, if your son was wearing, and this is probably more accurate to Jack, maybe if your son had long hair and was wearing more feminine clothing, you wouldn't say, you're not a man anymore. It's unkind to say that to Jack just because he's trans. He can dress and present himself however he wants, and he can call himself however he wants, and it's not hurting anyone.
Exactly. Well spoken, well said.
Thank you.
Love it. With that, I think we've hit our hour. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. I will turn the floor back to you.
Yeah, well, thank you all for being part of our discussion and enlightenment for many. And I think the takeaway is that this discussion continues, and it will
Very
continue. So thank you all for coming and for your